What would you do if you watched a man drag home a rusted, rotting pile of junk, and then found out that pile of junk was worth $5 million? The neighbors laughed. The kids pointed. Even the garbage men slowed down to stare. But Adrian Calloway didn't flinch, not once, because the man crouching in that driveway, covered in grease, wearing a flannel shirt with a busted button, that man was a billionaire. And he had just found something the entire world had been searching for 40 years. This is his story, and I promise you, you will not see the ending coming. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment telling me what city you're from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very last second. Let's go. The neighborhood of Sycamore Drive in Beaumont, Texas, was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, except when they didn't. And when they didn't, they made something up. It was a modest stretch of houses, the kind built sometime in the late 80s with good intentions and thin walls. The lawns were mostly maintained. The driveways held the usual mix of minivans and pickup trucks. On Friday nights in summer, you could smell 3 or 4 different barbecue setups running simultaneously, and somebody's kid was always bouncing a basketball at the wrong hour. It was, in the most honest terms possible, an ordinary street, which made Adrian Calloway all the more out of place, though almost nobody on Sycamore Drive understood that yet. He had moved in 18 months ago, quiet and unremarkable, paid cash for the house, which the real estate agent found slightly unusual but not enough to comment on. He drove a 2009 Ford F250 with a cracked passenger mirror that he had been meaning to fix for 6 months. He waved when neighbors waved, returned borrowed tools, kept his grass cut. His son Mason, 7 years old with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin, rode his bike up and down the sidewalk most afternoons, sometimes alone, sometimes with the Nguyen kids from 3 houses down. Nobody asked too many questions about Adrian. He had that quality, the kind of stillness that discourages interrogation. He wasn't cold, exactly. He would stop and talk about the weather or the Texans' latest disaster of a season. But there was always something sealed behind his eyes, a private room that he didn't open for visitors. And most people on Sycamore Drive had learned without being told that the room wasn't available for tours. What they did know, mostly through Darlene Hutchins at number 14, who made it her personal mission to know everything, was that his wife had died 2 years back. Cancer, someone said. Car accident, someone else said. Darlene herself claimed it was something sudden and terrible, and left it at that with the satisfied expression of a woman who knew more than she was sharing. What nobody on Sycamore Drive knew, what nobody in the greater Beaumont metropolitan area knew, for that matter, was that Adrian James Calloway had been listed in Forbes 3 years running. That the private consulting work he did from his garage was actually the quiet management of a tech infrastructure company he had built from a rented storage unit at age 24. That the worn flannel shirts and the cracked mirror were not signs of financial struggle, but of a man who had deliberately stepped away from a world that demanded he perform a version of himself he no longer wanted to be. He wasn't hiding, exactly. He had just stopped raising his hand. The garage behind his house was the one place where the sealed room opened slightly. It was large, larger than it looked from the street, and meticulously organized in a way that suggested a specific kind of mind. Tools hung on pegboards with painted outlines marking exactly where each one belonged. A hydraulic lift sat in the center. One wall held a long workbench covered in the controlled chaos of active projects, carburetor parts, timing equipment, coils of wire sorted by gauge. A small space heater hummed in the corner during cold months. There was a folding chair near the garage door that had somehow accumulated a permanent cup holder, a dog-eared copy of a 1974 automotive engineering textbook, and Mason's half-finished drawings of race cars that bore no resemblance to any vehicle that had ever existed. That garage was where Adrian Calloway went to think, and in the 18 months since arriving on Sycamore Drive, he had done a considerable amount of thinking there. It was a Saturday in late October when everything changed, though none of the neighbors recognized it at the time. The morning had started like most Saturdays. Mason had woken up at 6:15 demanding pancakes, which Adrian made badly as always. Slightly burned on one side, slightly underdone on the other, and Mason ate them without complaint because he had inherited his father's ability to accept imperfection with dignity. They ate together at the kitchen table with the television off, which was their rule on weekend mornings. Mason drew another impossible race car while Adrian drank his coffee and read something on his phone with a frown that had nothing to do with the coffee. By 9 o'clock, Adrian had loaded Mason into the truck with a promise of a stop at Whataburger on the way home, and they drove 40 minutes east to the Beaumont Municipal Salvage Yard on Route 90. The salvage yard was the kind of place that had a smell before it had a shape. Rust and oil and old rubber, and something underneath those, something organic and difficult to name. It sprawled across 6 acres behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that had gone sideways in sections. A hand-painted sign at the entrance read, "Bertram's Auto Salvage, cash only, no exceptions." And below that, in smaller letters that someone had added later, "Seriously, no exceptions." Old Bertram himself, who was not actually named Bertram but had inherited both the business and the nickname from his uncle, sat in a lawn chair just inside the gate with a thermos of something that was probably not coffee. He was 71 years old, built like a man who had spent a lifetime lifting things, and he had the specific wariness of someone who had been talked into too many bad deals over too many decades. "Calloway," he said, when Adrian and Mason walked through the gate. "Bertram." Adrian nodded. "What's new in the back 40? Bertram scratched his jaw. "Got a delivery Thursday. Some stuff out of an estate auction up near Houston. Didn't go through it all yet." He looked at Mason. "You keep your hands visible, boy. There's sharp things back there." "Yes, sir," Mason said seriously, and held both hands out in front of him like a surgeon preparing to operate, which made Bertram almost smile. They walked the yard for an hour. This was something Adrian did with a kind of quiet patience that Mason had learned to mirror, moving slowly through the rows of stripped vehicles and stacked parts, eyes moving methodically, touching things occasionally, rarely speaking. Mason had developed his own system for these walks, which involved categorizing everything he saw by color and assigning it a points value that made sense only to him. He kept a running tally in his head and would announce the final score on the drive home. Adrian almost missed it. It was shoved against the back fence, partially hidden behind the collapsed shell of a mid-90s Chevy pickup. You could see maybe a third of it from the main path, and what you could see was discouraging. A crushed front quarter panel, no hood, what appeared to be severe frame damage along the driver's side. The windshield was gone. The interior was gutted down to bare metal. The paint, whatever color it had once been, was buried under a uniform coat of rust so complete it looked almost deliberate. Adrian stopped. He stood there for a moment, not moving. In that way he had that Mason privately thought of as Dad going somewhere in his brain. Then he crouched down. He moved the Chevy carcass aside. It was lighter than it looked, mostly shell, and got low, examining the underside of the wreck. His hand moved along the frame rail slowly, the way a person runs a finger along a line of text they're reading carefully. He tilted his head. He stood up, walked around to the other side, crouched again. "Dad," Mason said. "What is it?" "Don't know yet," Adrian said, which was his standard answer when he did know but wasn't ready to say. He spent another 12 minutes examining the car without speaking. Mason found a piece of twisted chrome and added it to his point system. The morning got warmer. Somewhere in the middle of the salvage yard, a crow was making complaints about something. Finally, Adrian stood up and dusted his hands on his jeans. "Go find Bertram," he said. The negotiation took less time than you'd expect. Bertram walked back with Mason and looked at the wreck with the expression of a man being shown a particularly disappointing casserole. "That came in with the Houston estate lot," he said. "Whoever owned it, they didn't know what they had, and what they had was a pile of junk." "What do you want for it?" Adrian asked. Bertram looked at him with the calculation of a man who had been selling things for 50 years. "You see something in it." "I see a project," Adrian said, which was technically true. "I was going to crush it end of the month. Nothing usable." Bertram kicked one of the flattened tires without enthusiasm. "Tell you what, $100, you haul it off today. Saves me the trouble." Adrian paid in cash, which he always had, and arranged for a flatbed out of town to deliver it to Sycamore Drive that afternoon. On the drive home, Mason ate his Whataburger and announced that Saturday's salvage yard score was 412 points, which was a personal record. Adrian drove and didn't say much, but he was doing something with his left hand that Mason recognized, tapping a specific rhythm against his thigh, 3 beats and a pause. 3 beats and a pause. It was the thing he did when he was working something out. Mason didn't ask about it. He'd learned that some things needed to be worked out in silence first. The flatbed arrived at 2:30 that afternoon. By 2:45, Sycamore Drive had an audience. It started with Dale Hutchins, who was washing his car in the driveway at number 14 and stopped with the hose still running when the flatbed rolled past. His wife Darlene appeared from the front door 30 seconds later with the specific radar of a person who operates a neighborhood information network. By 3 o'clock, there were 6 people standing on the sidewalk across from Adrian's house, and by 3:15 there were 11, including Roger Pressman from the corner who had driven back from Home Depot specifically because Darlene had called him. The car, lowered by the flatbed onto Adrian's driveway, looked even worse in full daylight and in relation to normal human beings who could stand next to it for scale. It was a small vehicle, compact, low to the ground, though the exact original dimensions were hard to determine given the damage. The body was crumpled at multiple points. The rust was comprehensive. There was a section of the roof that had partially collapsed. One of the rear wheel wells was so deformed it looked like the car had been angry about something and tried to fold itself in half. "Lord have mercy," Darlene said. "He paid to have that delivered?" Roger said. $100, I heard, said Dale, though he hadn't heard this from any reliable source. "You can't even tell what it is," said Keisha Washington from number 9, who had joined the group with her twins in a double stroller. "Is that a car?" "It was," Roger said. "Once, probably." From across the street, Adrian directed the flatbed driver with hand signals, got the car positioned correctly on his driveway, signed some paperwork, and thanked the driver with a handshake. Then he stood in front of the wreck with his hands on his hips and looked at it for a while. He must have felt his audience because he glanced across the street. He didn't seem bothered by the collection of neighbors. He gave a small, unremarkable wave, the kind of wave that says, "Yeah, I see you," rather than "hello," and then turned back to the car. "He's going to restore that?" Darlene said. "He'd be better off burning it," Roger said. "Maybe he paid $100 too much," Dale said, and several people laughed. Mason appeared from the side of the house, still holding what was left of his Whataburger wrapper, and stood beside his father looking at the car with the same expression his father wore. Not enthusiasm, exactly, but a kind of serious engagement, a willingness to contend with the thing in front of him. "What do we do first?" Mason asked. "Clean it up," Adrian said. "You don't know what you're dealing with until you can see it." Mason nodded like this was perfectly reasonable advice about anything. Across the street, Darlene was already composing the next-door post in her head. Evelyn Pierce had been working the 6-to-2 shift at Ronnie's Diner on Magnolia Avenue for 3 years, which meant she had served approximately 47,000 cups of coffee to people she'd mostly never see again, endured 2 managers who couldn't organize a grocery list, survived a kitchen fire that had been significantly more dramatic than the local news reported, and saved slightly less money than she needed to feel like she was getting somewhere. She was 30 years old, which she was mostly fine with, though some mornings it surprised her. She had her mother's practicality and her father's stubbornness, which was a combination that served her better than she gave it credit for. Her apartment on Sycamore Drive, she rented the small upstairs unit at number 7, was clean and sparse in the way of someone who has learned not to accumulate things they might have to move quickly. She owned exactly what she used and used most of what she owned. She had noticed Adrian Calloway the way you notice someone who exists at the edge of your peripheral vision, not with great interest, but with the background awareness of a person trying to understand their environment. She knew he was quiet. She knew he had a kid. She knew he worked in his garage at odd hours because she could see the light from her bedroom window on nights when she was up late, which was often. She had not introduced herself in 18 months, which she was privately embarrassed about, but had been too busy surviving to address. The Saturday the car arrived, she was walking home from a late shift. The 2 o'clock had stretched to 5 because Carla had called in sick, and Ronnie's scheduling was always a fiction. And she came down Sycamore Drive to find the usual Saturday evening version of the street, which was quiet in the specific way of a place that had been noisier earlier. She could see the remains of the neighborhood audience, mostly dispersed now. A few people still lingering near the Hutchins driveway talking. She almost walked past. Then she saw the car. It was sitting in Adrian's driveway, under a work light he'd set up on a stand, and Adrian was crouching next to it doing something with a wire brush, and the light hit the rusted body in a way that made it look almost architectural, all these layers of damage and time made visible. She stopped on the sidewalk without quite meaning to. She'd worked around enough machinery at various jobs not to be completely ignorant about cars. Her father had restored a '68 Mustang over the course of her entire childhood, which meant she'd grown up watching someone love something back into existence, piece by piece, with more patience than money. She knew enough to know that whatever Adrian was looking at under that work light, it wasn't what most people saw when they looked at the wreck. The way he moved around it, deliberate, unhurried, touching specific points with specific intention, reminded her of the way her father used to crouch next to that Mustang on Sunday mornings with his coffee going cold beside him. Like the car was telling him something and he was listening. She stood there longer than she meant to, long enough that he looked up. "Sorry," she said immediately, which was a reflex. I just live up there." She pointed at number 7. He looked where she pointed, then back at her. "I know. I've seen you." She wasn't sure what to say to that. "I'm Adrian," he said, and stood up, which meant he was taller than she'd realized. He didn't offer his hand because his hands were covered in rust-colored dust. He gestured at them as explanation. "Evelyn? Evelyn Pierce." He nodded. Then he looked back at the car, which she understood to be not rudeness, but simply the thing pulling his attention. "What is it?" she asked. "I mean, what was it?" He paused before answering, which she would come to understand was how he handled questions he was thinking carefully about. "Don't know exactly yet." "Why did you buy it?" Another pause. "Because nobody else saw it." She looked at the wreck, the crushed panels, the collapsed roof section, the comprehensive rust, the general appearance of something that had given up. And she looked at Adrian, who was looking at the same thing she was looking at, but clearly seeing something different. "I'll let you get to it," she said. "Okay," he said, already back to crouching. She walked up to her apartment, made herself dinner, and sat at her kitchen table with her window open because the October air was finally doing what October air was supposed to do. From 3 houses down, she could see the work light still burning. She thought about what he'd said, because nobody else saw it. It was a strange thing to say about $100 wreck, but something about the certainty in his voice made it feel less strange than it should have. Adrian worked every night that first week. After Mason was in bed, he would go to the garage or out to the driveway and work until midnight, or 1, sometimes later. He had the discipline of someone who could function on 5 hours of sleep indefinitely, which he'd built out of necessity during the early years of his company when there had been no alternative to functioning on 5 hours of sleep indefinitely. The first task was cleaning. Not restoring, just seeing. He removed decades of accumulated grime with solvents and wire brushes and a pressure washer borrowed from the Nguyen family, working layer by layer the way an archaeologist uncovers something fragile and potentially significant. Mason helped on Sunday afternoon with the water hose and a sponge and an enthusiasm for the work that was more chaotic than useful, but which Adrian accommodated with patience. What emerged beneath the rust, slowly, section by section, was surprising. Not the body, which remained badly damaged and would need extensive work regardless, but the architecture underneath. The frame rails, where accessible, showed geometry that was not standard. The suspension pickup points were in positions Adrian had to measure twice because he wasn't certain he was reading the rusted metal correctly. The rear subframe, cleaned to a point where he could actually examine it, revealed fabrication work of exceptional precision, hand-built, clearly, not stamped from a factory die. He found the first marking on the 3rd night. It was stamped into the frame rail on the driver's side, partially obscured by a bracket that had been welded on at some point and then partially removed, leaving a ghost of itself. Adrian spent 40 minutes with a chemical rust treatment and a flashlight before the numbers and letters were clear enough to read. He sat back on his heels in the driveway and looked at what he'd uncovered for a long time. Then he went inside and opened his laptop. He was still at the laptop at 3 in the morning, with 4 browser tabs open and the remains of a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow, and the expression on his face was the one he wore when he was trying very hard not to jump to a conclusion he couldn't yet support. Evelyn brought coffee on Tuesday. She hadn't planned it. She'd made a full pot before her Wednesday morning shift and found herself with more than she needed and a reason to not stay in her apartment staring at her budget spreadsheet, which had stopped containing good news some weeks ago. She put some in a thermos, the red one, which was the only one she had, and walked down the street at 8:30 p.m. which she told herself was a perfectly normal thing to do and which she knew was not entirely about the coffee. The garage door was open. Adrian was underneath the car on a creeper, only his legs visible. Mason was sitting on the folding chair with a coloring book, working with the specific intensity of a 7-year-old who has decided that coloring is a professional endeavor. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the garage. "I made too much coffee," she said, which was the announcement she'd prepared. Mason looked up. "Dad drinks a lot of coffee," he reported helpfully. "He says it's a character flaw." From under the car, "It is a character flaw." "I've got a thermos," Evelyn said. Adrian slid out from under the car on the creeper. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a stain on the shoulder that was probably not recent, and he had a smudge of something dark across one cheekbone. And he looked, she noticed, and then decided she hadn't noticed. Not bad for a man who had been lying on pavement. He sat up and looked at the thermos. "Red thermos," he said. "Only one I have." "What kind?" "Dark roast. From Ronnie's Diner. I work there. I have access." He accepted the thermos and poured some into the cup of a cup that was sitting on the garage floor and had the words "World's Okayest Mechanic" printed on the side. He drank. He nodded. "Good," he said. "I know," she said, because it was. She stayed for an hour. She sat on an overturned bucket near Mason's chair. Adrian produced the bucket from somewhere with the efficiency of a man who always knows where the extra bucket is, and she watched him work while Mason explained his coloring book to her in detail that suggested he had given the backstories of each character considerable thought. She found herself watching Adrian's hands more than anything else. The way they moved over the car was different from anything she'd seen before. Not confident in the showy sense, but certain. Like someone reading a language they've known their whole life. He didn't fumble. He didn't second guess. He moved from one thing to the next with an economy of motion that suggested a brain working significantly faster than the hands it was directing. "Can I ask what you're looking for?" she said, during a gap in Mason's narrative. He didn't answer immediately. She was starting to understand that his silences were not evasions. They were him deciding whether the thing he was about to say was actually what he meant to say. "I found some markings," he said, "on the frame, serial numbers, basically, but not standard." He paused. This car was hand-built, which isn't unusual for a custom project, but the geometry is, there are things here that don't match anything in normal production. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet," he said, and she believed him, and she also believed that "yet" was carrying significant weight in that sentence. Mason looked up from his coloring. "Dad thinks it's special." "Mason," Adrian said, which was a one-word sentence that meant, "Don't say things I haven't decided yet." "He does, though," Mason told Evelyn, undeterred. Evelyn looked at the car, the damaged, ugly, rust-eaten car sitting in the fluorescent wash of the garage lights, and tried to see what Adrian saw in it. She couldn't, quite, but she could see something in the way he looked at it, a focus that had nothing to do with $100 investments. She walked home at 9:30 with the empty thermos, and she was thinking about something her father had said once, standing over his Mustang with his hands on his hips on a cold Saturday morning. The thing about broken things is, most people stop looking at them, which means most people never see what's underneath. She hadn't thought about that in years. By Thursday, the novelty of the rusted wreck had converted, on Sycamore Drive, from a source of mockery into something more complicated. It had started with Dale Hutchins, who had nothing better to do on his day off, and wandered down the sidewalk Thursday morning with the pretense of checking his mailbox, which was in the opposite direction, and ended up standing in front of Adrian's driveway for 15 minutes. He couldn't see much. The car was inside the garage now, positioned on the lift, and the garage door was closed. But he could hear something. Metal. And a kind of deliberate quiet between the sounds that felt, somehow, significant. He mentioned it to Darlene. Darlene, who operated with the situational intelligence of a small field general, made 3 phone calls and a next-door post that was technically a question about neighborhood noise ordinances, but was actually a dispatch requesting reconnaissance. By Thursday evening, there was a pattern of foot traffic past number 12. People walking dogs, walking children, walking nothing. That was sufficiently unusual that even Mason noticed and mentioned it to his father. "Why do people keep going past?" Mason asked. "Curiosity," Adrian said. "About the car?" "Probably." Mason thought about this. Should we close the blinds? Adrian almost smiled. We don't have anything to hide, bud. This was not entirely accurate, as it turned out. What Adrian had been doing, in the hours when he wasn't cleaning or examining, was research. He had taken photographs of every marking, every stamped number, every piece of hand-fabricated geometry he could find, and he had sent them, carefully and without identifying context, to 3 people. One was a retired automotive engineer he'd met at a conference in Dallas 4 years earlier and trusted with a specific kind of technical judgment. One was a vintage racing historian based in Austin who maintained an archive of pre-1980 motorsport documentation that had no public counterpart. The third was a fabrication specialist in England who had spent 30 years identifying hand-built racing components for insurance purposes. He hadn't told any of them where the car was. He hadn't told them he owned it. He had sent photographs and asked questions in the detached, technical language of someone conducting theoretical research. All 3 had responded within 48 hours, which was unusual. The kind of unusual that happened when something made someone's hand move faster than their professional caution. The Austin historian, a woman named Deborah Shanks, who had once taken 6 months to return an email about a 1962 Le Mans entry list, responded in 4 hours with a message that was, for her, extremely agitated in tone. It contained 3 questions, 7 technical observations, and 1 sentence that Adrian read several times. If these photographs represent what I think they represent, you need to be extremely careful about who you tell. He sat with that for a while. Then he kept working. Friday night, Evelyn brought the red thermos again. She told herself she was being neighborly. This was mostly true and also mostly a simplification. The garage door was open. Adrian was at the workbench this time, not under the car, bent over something under a magnifying lamp with an intensity that made her pause at the threshold before saying anything. Mason was asleep. She could see the light was off in his bedroom window from the street, which meant it was past 9 and Adrian was alone with whatever he was looking at. Coffee, she said softly, in case the intensity required quiet. He looked up. He'd been somewhere else. She could see the moment he came back. Thanks, he said. Come in. She poured for him into the world's okayest mechanic mug and poured some for herself into the thermos cap, which worked well enough. She looked at what was on the workbench. It was a panel, a small piece of bodywork, clean to bare metal, and under the magnifying lamp she could see markings she wouldn't have been able to read without it. What are you looking at? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been looking into the history of this car. And? There are some things I'm not ready to say yet. She looked at him. But you know something. I think I know something, he said carefully. I'm not certain. What's the version where you're right? She asked. He looked at her steadily. The version where I'm right is unusual. She waited. He put down the tool he was holding, a small brass implement she couldn't identify, and leaned back against the workbench and crossed his arms in the posture of a man deciding how much to say. In 1973, he said, there was a racing team out of Chicago called Caldwell Rice Motorsports. They ran endurance races, long distance, that kind of thing. They had an engineer named Frank Welder who was... He stopped. Who was apparently exceptional. The kind of engineer who sees things other people don't. He was developing a car, a prototype, new suspension geometry, a kind of frame design that nobody had tried. The idea was to test it at a few smaller circuits before a major entry. Evelyn watched him. The car was never raced. The team folded in 1974. Money problems, the usual. The prototype was supposed to be sold at auction, but there was a fire at the team's storage facility. Everything was believed destroyed. The car, the blueprints, Frank Welder's technical documentation. He paused. Frank Welder disappeared after that. No one in the motorsport world could find him. He just stopped existing as far as public record goes. The garage was quiet. From somewhere outside, a dog was barking at something it had probably imagined. The prototype became a kind of legend, Adrian said. In vintage racing circles, anyway. The design ideas that Welder had documented, some of them showed up in other engineers' work years later, which means someone had seen the blueprints before the fire. But the car itself was considered gone. Evelyn looked at the rusted vehicle on the lift, at the crushed panels and the collapsed roof, and the comprehensive damage that had made an entire neighborhood laugh. "You think that's it?" she said. "I think there's a significant possibility," Adrian said, "based on the frame markings, based on the geometry, based on what 3 different people who don't know each other have said when they saw the photographs." He uncrossed his arms. "But I need more evidence before I say it out loud to anyone who matters." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "How much would it be worth?" she said. "If you're right." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I'm not sure there's a number." She looked at him, at the grease-stained shirt and the tired eyes and the magnifying lamp and the small brass tool on the workbench. And she said, "And you're in here alone at 9:30 on a Friday night." "I'm usually in here alone at 9:30 on a Friday night," he said. "I know," she said. "I've seen the light." He looked at her, really looked, in a way he didn't often do with people. And there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not guarded, exactly. Something more complicated than guarded. "It's a good project," he said, which was not what he'd meant to say, and they both probably knew it. She stayed until 11. They talked, mostly, about other things. Mason's school, the diner, a conversation about the Beaumont weather, which was a reliable topic because the Beaumont weather was reliably terrible. Normal things. The kind of conversation that exists on the surface but carries something else underneath. The way the car's surface carried something underneath that nobody on Sycamore Drive could see. When she left, Adrian watched her walk up the street toward number 7, and then he turned back to the garage and looked at the rusted wreck on the lift for a long time. He thought about Frank Welder, a man who had built something extraordinary and watched it disappear. A man who had then disappeared himself. He thought about things that go missing, things that seem lost, things that are actually just waiting for the right person to stop walking past and actually look. He picked up the brass tool and went back to work. What nobody on Sycamore Drive knew about Adrian Calloway, what almost nobody anywhere knew, because he had taken considerable care to ensure this, was that the weight behind his eyes had a specific name. Her name had been Rachel. Rachel Calloway, née Bird, had died 26 months ago on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day with no business being that kind of day. She had been 30 years old. She had been, and this was the thing that made the ordinary Tuesday so incomprehensible, healthy as far as anyone had known. The aneurysm had given no warning and taken less than 12 hours. Adrian had been in a meeting in Austin when his phone rang. He had landed the company's largest contract that week. He remembered this with the helpless clarity of a man who cannot stop knowing it, that he had been shaking someone's hand in congratulation at approximately the same time. He had never fully decided what to do with this information. He had handled the aftermath the way he handled most problems, which was with tremendous competence and almost no discussion. The practical arrangements, the estate, Mason's school, the decision to sell the Austin house and find somewhere smaller and quieter, all of it executed with the efficiency of a man whose whole life had been the construction of systems that worked without requiring him to feel things at dangerous times. He was, he knew, not entirely okay. He was also, he knew, okay enough. There was a difference, and he was trying to live in it. Mason helped. Mason helped in the way that children help in these circumstances. Not by being comforting, which was not the job of a 7-year-old, but by being continuous. By needing breakfast and school and coloring books and impossible race car drawings and the presence of a father who showed up. The requirement of showing up was, it turned out, very useful to a man who might otherwise have stopped doing much else. The garage also helped. There was something about work that required all of you, physical and mental, both hands and the thinking brain, precision and patience, that made it impossible to be somewhere else at the same time. When Adrian was working, he was only working. The grief waited outside the garage door. It was always there when he came out, and he had accepted this, but for the hours he was inside, he got a break from it. The wreck was, in this sense, more than a project. He hadn't said this to anyone. He wasn't sure he could say it to anyone in a way that made sense from the outside. But on Friday nights in his garage with the work light burning and the neighborhood quiet and Mason asleep in the house, and a thermos of good coffee someone had thought to bring, on those nights, something that had been very tight in him for 2 years was slightly less tight. He didn't know what to do with that either. He went back to work. By Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after he dragged home the wreck that made the neighborhood laugh, Adrian Calloway had been awake for 31 of the last 36 hours. He was sitting on the garage floor, back against the wall, with his knees up and a cold cup of coffee beside him and his laptop open on his thighs. The email he'd just received was 4 paragraphs long. It was from Deborah Shanks in Austin, and its tone had moved beyond agitated into something that he could only describe as carefully controlled alarm. She had found documentation. Archive materials from a Chicago Racing Federation, partially digitized in 2019, that included a partial build log for a vehicle matching the frame numbers Adrian had photographed. The build log included a chassis code. The chassis code matched. At the bottom of the email she had written, "I don't need to tell you what this means. I think you already know. I would strongly recommend you take very seriously what you do next, and who you tell, and when. There are people who have been looking for this vehicle for a very long time." Adrian read the email twice. Then he closed the laptop and set it aside and sat with his knees up in the quiet garage, looking at the wreck on the lift. It was still ugly, still damaged, still the thing the whole neighborhood had laughed at a week ago. But he knew what it was now. The question was what to do about it. Outside, Sycamore Drive was waking up. He could hear the Nguyen kids' voices, distant, a car starting. The Saturday sounds of an ordinary neighborhood with no idea that the quiet man in the garage at number 12 was sitting in the middle of something extraordinary. Adrian Calloway set down his coffee, stood up, and walked back to the car. He had work to do. The email from Deborah Shanks sat in Adrian's laptop like a small explosive device he hadn't yet decided what to do with. He'd read it 4 times by Sunday morning. Each time the words rearranged themselves slightly in his understanding. Not the meaning, which was clear, but the weight of the meaning, which kept getting heavier. He'd printed it once, looked at the printed copy, and then torn it up and put it in the kitchen trash under the coffee grounds because having it on paper felt like leaving a window open. Mason had woken up at 6:45 that Sunday asking for cereal, and Adrian had made it, and they'd sat at the kitchen table together with the television off the way they always did on weekend mornings. And Adrian had watched his son eat Cheerios with the focused dedication of someone taking the task seriously, and he had thought, not yet for any of this. He needed more before he moved. That was the thing about making decisions with incomplete information. He'd watched enough people do it, in business and in life, to know that the speed of a decision was almost never its most important quality. What mattered was what you knew when you made it. So he went back to work. The second week with the car was different from the first. The cleaning phase was mostly done. What remained was examination, methodical, documented, the kind of work that required a camera and a notebook more than a wire brush. Adrian photographed everything, every weld seam, every machine surface, every stamped number he could find, and he found 6 more after the first one, scattered through the frame and subframe in places that suggested deliberate obscurity. Not hidden, exactly, but placed where only someone looking very carefully would find them. Frank Welder, whoever he had been, had not made things easy to read. But he had made them possible to read, for someone patient enough. Adrian was patient. He cross-referenced each new marking against the documentation Deborah had sent. A partial scan of the build log, 14 pages of faded type, and hand-notated margins that she'd photographed from a microfilm archive at the Chicago Racing Federation's historical collection. The handwriting in the margins was cramped and precise, the notes of an engineer who thought faster than he wrote and was trying to keep up with himself. Some of it Adrian could read. Some of it required him to stare at the screen for extended periods until the shapes resolved into letters. On Monday night, he found the plate. It was underneath the dashboard mounting bracket, in a location so deliberately inconspicuous that he almost missed it even knowing to look carefully. A small aluminum plate, riveted to the frame, no larger than a business card. The surface was corroded but not destroyed. Under the magnifying lamp and with a chemical treatment that took 40 minutes to work properly, 7 characters emerged from the corrosion. He looked at them for a long time. Then he typed them into his laptop. The results confirmed what Deborah's documentation had suggested. The plate was a builder's mark, a specific identifier that Caldwell Rice Motorsports had used on all vehicles that cleared their internal fabrication certification. It meant the car had been completed. Not just started, not abandoned mid-build, but finished and certified by the team's own standards. The prototype had been completed, and then it had disappeared for 40 years into a salvage yard in Houston. Adrian sat back in his garage chair and stared at the ceiling for a while. The work light hummed. From Mason's room distantly, he could hear the sound of his son talking in his sleep, a habit Mason had inherited from Rachel, who had carried on entire coherent-sounding conversations while fully unconscious, which had confused Adrian significantly during the first months of their marriage before he understood what was happening. He thought about her for a moment, not with the usual bracing quality the thoughts arrived with, more just, you would have had something to say about this. Rachel had always had something to say. She'd had opinions about everything from municipal planning to the ethics of buffet restaurants, and she'd delivered them with the confidence of someone who had done the research and was not particularly interested in debate. He had loved this about her in the way you love things that simultaneously exasperate you. She would have said something practical, something that cut through the complexity to whatever the actual question was. The actual question was, what now? He had something extraordinary sitting in his garage. He had documentation that could support, not prove yet, but support, what he believed it was. He had 3 experts who had seen photographs and reacted with the kind of urgency that didn't attach itself to ordinary things. He had a neighborhood full of people waiting for him to either produce something remarkable or confirm that he was, as Roger Pressman had said, a man who had paid $100 too much. He poured the last of the cold coffee into his mug and drank it without complaint and picked up his camera and went back to work. It was 11:30 at night. He had work tomorrow, calls with his company's operations team, a situation in their Denver data center that had been developing for 2 weeks and required his attention. Mason had school. The lawn needed cutting. He worked until 2. Evelyn brought the red thermos on Tuesday and Wednesday both. She had stopped making explanations for it after the first time, which Adrian appreciated because he had noticed during the explanations that she was better than the explanations gave her credit for. She was sharp and direct in a way that revealed itself gradually, the way warm weather reveals itself in February. Not all at once, but accumulating. On Wednesday, she brought a second mug, her own, which was a development Adrian registered without comment. They talked more on Wednesday than they had on any previous night. She asked better questions than most people. Not about the car's value or what he was going to do with it. The questions everyone around her seemed to be asking, based on the amount of foot traffic that continued to cruise past number 12, but about the engineering itself. About what made the geometry unusual. About Frank Welder and what it meant to disappear from your own history. Do you think he meant to disappear? She asked. Or do you think it just happened to him? Adrian considered this. I think some disappearances are chosen and some are fallen into, he said. And sometimes the person doing the disappearing isn't sure which it is until later. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. That sounds like something you've thought about before. I've thought about most things before, he said, which was true and also not entirely the answer to what she'd asked. She didn't push it. She had a quality he was starting to identify, an ability to recognize when a door was not fully closed and to stand near it without forcing it. It was a more sophisticated quality than it appeared, and it was rarer than people seemed to understand. On Thursday, the automotive world found out. He didn't know exactly how it happened. He had been careful. He believed he had been careful. The photographs he'd sent were stripped of location data. The questions he'd asked were oblique. But Deborah Shanks, for all her archival discipline, apparently had a contact in the vintage racing community with whom she had shared her excitement at a level that exceeded her discretion, and that contact had a forum presence, and the forum had several thousand members, some of whom treated this kind of intelligence the way day traders treat market rumors. By Thursday afternoon, there was a thread on a vintage motorsport forum titled Caldwell Rice Prototype, Located? That had 47 replies before Adrian found it at 7 p.m. while making Mason's dinner. He stood at the stove with a spatula in one hand and his phone in the other, reading the thread with the feeling of a man watching water seep under a door he'd thought was sealed. The thread was mostly speculation. Nobody had a location. Nobody had a name. But the photographs he'd sent Deborah had apparently been shared. He could see the watermarks had been cropped. And several people on the forum had reached the same conclusion he had about the frame numbers, which meant the information was no longer contained. He finished making dinner. He served Mason his spaghetti and sat across from him and listened to Mason's account of an injustice that had occurred at recess involving a disputed boundary in a game whose rules Mason explained with the intensity of a legal argument. Adrian asked appropriate questions. He helped with the homework that followed. He read 2 chapters of the book they were working through together, which was an adventure story about a 12-year-old who discovered a map and whose parents were both conveniently absent from the plot, as was traditional. He put Mason to bed. Then he went to the garage and called Deborah Shanks. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call. "I know," she said, before he said anything. "How much did you tell him?" A pause. "More than I should have. I'm sorry, Adrian. I was excited. You have to understand, I've been looking at records and documentation of this car for 15 years. When I thought it might actually exist..." She stopped. "It doesn't excuse it. I should have been more careful." "It's out now," he said. "Yes." "Who's going to come looking?" Another pause, this one heavier. "The forum membership includes people who work for several major collections, private collectors who have standing offers for anything connected to Caldwell Rice, and..." She hesitated. "Victor Laurent has a Google alert for that chassis code. Has for years, I'm told." The name landed in the garage like something physical. Victor Laurent was not a name that required explanation in motorsport circles, and Adrian knew the circles well enough. Laurent was 73 years old, French-American, and had spent 40 years building one of the most significant private automotive collections in the world from a base in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He had raced himself in his 30s, Formula Atlantic style, some endurance work, before an accident in 1981 ended his driving career and redirected his formidable energy into acquisition and preservation. His collection was rumored to contain vehicles that museums had been trying to borrow for decades. He was known for 2 things equally: his taste, which was exceptional, and his persistence, which was legendary. He had been publicly associated with the search for the Caldwell Rice prototype at least twice in automotive press coverage that Adrian had already found in his research. Once in a 2009 interview where he'd called it the most significant unrecovered vehicle in American motorsport history. Once in a 2017 charity auction where he'd purchased a fragment of what was claimed to be original Caldwell Rice bodywork, later determined to be a fabrication, for an amount that had caused considerable comment at the time. "How long do I have?" Adrian asked. "Before someone shows up," Deborah said. "If Laurent has a Google alert and the forum post is indexed, I wouldn't assume more than a few days." He looked at the car, at the dents and the damage and the work he'd done and the work that remained. At the plate he'd uncovered Monday night, the 7 characters that confirmed what the car was. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I'm sorry I created the problem," she said. "You confirmed what I already knew," he said. "The problem would have come eventually." He hung up and sat in the garage with his hands on his knees for a while, thinking. The neighborhood was quiet. The work light hummed. The car sat on the lift under the fluorescent glow, still damaged, still ugly, but no longer anonymous. He thought about what to do next and made a decision that surprised him slightly, which was that he wasn't going to do anything yet. He was going to keep working. He was going to document everything he could document in the time he had, because whatever happened next, he wanted to know this car fully before it became something else, before it became an event instead of a project, before the world arrived and took it out of the quiet space of what it had been, when it was just him and a $100 wreck and a work light and cold coffee. He picked up his camera. He had a few days. He was going to use them. The next morning, Friday, Mason announced at breakfast that several kids at school had asked him if his dad was famous. Adrian looked up from his coffee. "What did you say?" "I said no," Mason said. "Are you?" "No," Adrian said. Mason considered this with the thorough fairness he applied to most questions. "Okay," he said. "But Tommy Nguyen said his mom heard that you found something important in the car." "Tommy Nguyen's mom doesn't know what's in the car." "That's what I said." Mason ate a spoonful of cereal. "I said Dad doesn't talk about the car to people." He paused. "Except to the coffee lady." Adrian looked at his son. "The coffee lady. Evelyn. She comes with the red thermos." Mason said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting observable facts. "She stays for a long time." "She's a neighbor," Adrian said. "Mm-hmm," Mason said, in a tone that implied he was filing this information in a category Adrian might not have intended. Adrian drank his coffee and said nothing further, which was a tactical decision. He called Evelyn that afternoon, which was the first time he had called her. He'd gotten her number from the building's shared information sheet that all tenants on the block had contributed to, which had seemed appropriate and also slightly cowardly, a distinction he chose not to examine. She picked up on the third ring. "Adrian?" "The situation has changed," he said. "With the car. I thought you should know." A beat. "How changed?" "Information got out. There are people in the vintage motorsport community who know something has been found. I don't think anyone knows where yet, but that's probably temporary." "How temporary?" "Days," he said. "Maybe less." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear background noise. The diner, probably, the sound of a kitchen working. "What does that mean for you?" "It means I need to decide some things before someone else decides them for me." He paused. "I thought you might want to be around for that conversation." The pause before she answered was short. "What time?" "Tonight, after Mason's asleep, 8:30. "I'll bring the thermos," she said. She arrived at 8:25, which he noticed. She had changed out of her work clothes, dark jeans and a green jacket that was slightly too big for her in a way that managed not to look bad. And she brought not just the thermos, but a box of the butter cookies from Ronnie's that were, objectively, one of the better things Ronnie's produced. Mason was asleep. The garage was warm. The October nights had dropped further, and he'd turned up the space heater. The car sat on the lift, cleaned and photographed and documented, more known than it had been a week ago, but still carrying its damage, still carrying all the years it had spent being nobody's priority. He told her everything, not in pieces, not carefully managed, all of it in order, from the frame markings to Deborah Shanks, to the forum thread to Victor Laurent's name and what it meant. He told her about Frank Welder and what he'd reconstructed of the man's history, which wasn't much but was more than nothing. He told her about the aluminum plate under the dashboard bracket and the 7 characters and what they confirmed. She listened without interrupting, which was a thing she did well. She ate one of the butter cookies and held her mug in both hands and looked at the car while he talked. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So someone's coming," she said. "Yes." "And you haven't decided what to do." "I know some of what I want," he said. "I haven't figured out how to get it." She looked at him. "What do you want?" It was the direct question, and he'd known she'd ask it eventually because directness was one of her primary qualities, and he'd been thinking about the answer for 2 days. "I want the car to mean something," he said. "Not just to be worth something. Those are different." She was quiet again. Outside, a car went past on Sycamore Drive, its headlights briefly crossing the garage wall. "Frank Welder built something extraordinary," Adrian said, "and then it disappeared, and so did he, and most of the world has no idea either of them ever existed. If I sell this car to whoever gets here first and it goes into a private collection somewhere and sits in a climate-controlled room where nobody sees it..." He stopped. "That feels like losing him again." Evelyn set down her mug on the workbench, carefully, in the space between a socket wrench and a tube of anti-seize compound. She looked at the car for a long moment. "Then don't let that happen," she said. "It's complicated when there's significant money involved." "Most worthwhile things are complicated when there's significant money involved," she said. "That's not a reason." He almost smiled at that. It was the kind of thing Rachel would have said, and the comparison arrived with the usual complexity. Not painful exactly, more like pressing on a place that was still healing. He acknowledged it and let it pass. "Victor Laurent has been looking for this car for decades," he said. "When he gets here. And he will get here, so he'll have a number ready. It'll be a number designed to make it hard to think clearly." "Will it work?" "I'm a billionaire," he said flatly. "Money doesn't..." He caught himself. It was the first time he'd said it to her. The word just landed there in the garage between them. She didn't react the way most people reacted. She didn't go still, didn't recalibrate the way he'd watched people recalibrate when they found out, reassessing everything they'd said in the new light of the information, adjusting their posture toward him. She just looked at him steadily. "Okay," she said. "That's it?" he said. "What do you want me to say?" He considered this. "Most people have more of a reaction." "I figured," she said. "The truck with the cracked mirror, the flannel shirts, you're not broke, but you also don't want people to know you're not broke. That's a specific choice." She picked up her mug again. "I just didn't know the number." Does the number change anything? She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. It changes the math on the stress you're carrying about Victor Laurent, she said. But it doesn't change anything about you. He was quiet. The point is, she said, you have leverage. If you walk into that conversation already knowing what you want, he can't move you with the number. The number's not the thing you're negotiating for. He looked at her. What am I negotiating for? Legacy, she said. You said it yourself. The car has to mean something, so make that the condition. You know what you want? Make it unmovable and let him work around it. It was not complicated advice. It was the kind of thing that sounded obvious once someone said it, and that he'd been circling for 2 days without landing on because he'd been too close to the problem. He had a tendency to over-engineer solutions when the straightforward version was available, and he knew this about himself, and it still kept happening. You're good at this, he said. I've done a lot of negotiating with landlords and shift managers, she said. The principle is the same. Know what you won't give up before you sit down. He nodded slowly. They sat in the warm garage with their coffee and the car and the space heater and the quiet of the neighborhood around them. A neighbor's sprinkler system started up somewhere. Someone had their timer set wrong for October and ran for a few minutes and shut off. Can I ask you something? Evelyn said. Yes. Why did you buy this car? She looked at it. Not the version you told Bertram. The real reason. The question sat in the air for a moment. He'd known it was coming eventually, in the way you know certain questions are waiting for you when someone is paying the kind of attention she paid. Because I recognized it, he said. Not the car specifically, just the thing underneath. Something everyone else has walked past. Something that got broken and nobody bothered to look at after that. He set down his mug. I've been spending 2 years feeling like that. She didn't fill the silence. She let it be what it was. I'm okay, he said, which was the sentence he'd been saying for 2 years. I just haven't. It's been hard to find the thing that makes me want to be somewhere, you know? Not just somewhere I'm supposed to be. Somewhere I actually want to be. He stopped. He hadn't said that to anyone. He wasn't sure why he'd said it to her, except that the garage at night had a quality that made certain things possible. I think I know what that's like, she said quietly. The feeling of going through the motions and waiting for something to feel real again. He looked at her. My life is not... I'm not comparing, she said quickly. What you've been through is different, but... She turned her mug in her hands. 3 years at the same diner, the same shifts, the same amount in the same bank account, no matter how carefully I manage it. There are days when I feel like I'm just... She didn't finish. Moving through it, he said. Yeah, she said, moving through it. They sat with that for a while. The space heater hummed. The car sat between them and around them in the way objects do when they become part of a moment, present, and also something more than themselves. I'm glad you stopped on the sidewalk that first night, he said. She looked at him with the beginning of a smile that she didn't quite let finish. I almost didn't. I know. I could tell. Could you? You had the expression of someone who had already talked themselves out of it and then didn't quite manage to walk away. She laughed. A short, real laugh, not polished. That is very accurate. He smiled. It was the full version, which was something Mason saw regularly and the rest of Sycamore Drive had never seen. They stayed until 10:30. When she left this time, walking up the street with the empty thermos, Adrian stood in the garage doorway and watched the neighborhood and thought about a man named Frank Welder who had built something extraordinary and let it disappear. And he thought about the difference between things that disappear because they're abandoned and things that disappear because they're waiting. He went inside. He checked on Mason, asleep, one arm hanging off the bed, in the specific graceless way of a child who had committed fully to unconsciousness. And he stood in the doorway of his son's room for a moment. The call came on Saturday morning at 9:47, while Adrian was teaching Mason to check the oil on the F-25. Oh, which was a practical skill Adrian believed should be part of a standard childhood curriculum. It was a 505 area code. Santa Fe. He answered it. He handed Mason the dipstick to examine on his own and walked to the end of the driveway. The voice on the phone was accented, the French underneath the American English still present after decades. and careful in the way of a man who had been in enough negotiations to know that the first 30 seconds determined the shape of everything that followed. "Mr. Calloway," the voice said, "my name is Victor Laurent. I believe we have something to discuss." Adrian looked down the length of Sycamore Drive, at the modest houses and the maintained lawns and the neighborhood that had watched him drag home a rusted wreck, and laughed about it, and felt something settle in him. Not certainty exactly, something more like readiness. "Mr. Laurent," he said, "I know who you are, and yes, I think we do." There was a pause, and then Laurent said with something that might have been relief after a very long wait, "May I come to Beaumont?" "You can come Tuesday," Adrian said. "I have some things I need to finish first." He hung up and stood in the driveway for a moment. From under the truck, Mason's voice, "Dad, the oil looks kind of brown." "That means it needs changing," Adrian said, and walked back to his son. Across the street, Dale Hutchins had come out for his morning paper and was watching with the specific expression of a man who knows something is happening and cannot figure out what it is. Adrian nodded at him. Dale nodded back, uncertain. The car was in the garage. Tuesday was 3 days away. And in those 3 days, Adrian Calloway intended to know that vehicle as completely as it was possible to know it. Every weld and every marking and every piece of hand-built precision that Frank Welder had put into it before the world lost track of both of them. Before it became worth millions of dollars to someone else, he was going to understand what it had cost one man to build it. He owed Welder that much. He wasn't sure why he felt that way, only that he did, and that he'd learned in the last 2 years to trust the feelings that arrived without full explanation. He went back into the garage and got to work. Sunday he photographed for 6 hours. Monday he documented. Monday night, after Mason was asleep, he called his company's legal team and had a 40-minute conversation that the lawyer on the other end found somewhat unusual, but followed with the professional neutrality of someone being paid to follow things. He had a framework in mind. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, exactly what Evelyn had said. Know what you won't give up before you sit down. He knew. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, Sycamore Drive was doing the thing that Sycamore Drive did when it sensed something. The slow-motion gathering that looked like coincidence but wasn't. Darlene Hutchins was gardening, which she never did on weekday mornings. Roger Pressman's car was in his driveway, which it shouldn't have been on a Tuesday. Keisha Washington was pushing the twins in the stroller in a route that happened to take her past number 12 at intervals. The black SUVs arrived at 11. 2 of them, Texas plates, the kind of vehicle that announced resources without advertising them. They parked in front of Adrian's house with the coordinated efficiency of a team that traveled together regularly. Victor Laurent got out of the second one. He was smaller than photographs suggested, not physically diminished, but compacted, the way people who have spent a lifetime moving through the world with intention can appear smaller than they are until they speak. He was 73, but moved without the apology of age. He wore a dark jacket that cost more than a month of Evelyn's diner salary, and he stood on the sidewalk in front of number 12 and looked at the house with the expression of a man who has been moving towards something for a very long time and has finally arrived. Adrian was already standing in the driveway, hands in his pockets, in the worn flannel shirt with the busted button. Laurent walked toward him. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Adrian with dark, evaluating eyes that had spent 50 years assessing things of value. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Laurent." Adrian nodded. "Is it here?" Laurent said. He asked it simply, without preamble, and the simplicity of it, the 40 years of waiting compressed into 3 words, was something Adrian registered. "It's here," he said. "Come and see." He led Victor Laurent into the garage, and he stepped aside and he watched the 73-year-old man see for the first time the thing he had spent decades looking for. What happened to Laurent's face in that moment was something Adrian had not quite prepared for. He'd expected satisfaction, or the practiced containment of a man who had been in enough high-stakes situations to control his reactions. He did not expect the way Laurent's shoulders changed, dropping by a degree that probably nobody who didn't know him would notice, or the single exhale, slow and long, like a man setting down something very heavy. Laurent walked to the car. He didn't touch it immediately. He walked around it slowly, looking, the way Adrian had looked at it in the salvage yard. He crouched in one spot, stood, crouched in another. And then he put his hand on the frame rail and left it there. After a minute, without turning, he said, "Do you know what you have?" "Yes," Adrian said. Laurent turned. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with money. "Then you know," he said, "that this is one of the most significant finds in the history of American motorsport." "I know," Adrian said. Laurent straightened, and then he named a number. It was $5 million. He said it the way a man says it when he has said it before, in his own mind, many times, not casually, but without drama. A considered number, a number meant to settle things. Adrian listened to it land. He thought about what Evelyn had said. He thought about Frank Welder. He thought about the aluminum plate with 7 characters that confirmed what the car was, and the 40 years it had spent being nobody's priority, and the way Laurent's hand had rested on the frame rail. "I'll consider it," he said. "But I have a condition." Laurent looked at him steadily. "Tell me." And Adrian told him. Outside on Sycamore Drive, 11 people who had been finding reasons to be visible on a Tuesday morning watched the 2 men through the open garage door, the old man in the expensive jacket and the quiet one in the flannel shirt, and could not hear a word that was being said, which was, as it turned out, exactly the way Adrian Calloway had wanted it. Victor Laurent did not respond immediately to Adrian's condition. That was notable. In Adrian's experience, and he had sat across from enough people in enough rooms to have developed a reliable read on negotiating behavior, the people who responded immediately to an unexpected condition were the ones who hadn't truly heard it. They were reacting to the shape of it before the content landed. Laurent didn't do that. He stood in the garage with his hand no longer on the car and his dark eyes on Adrian, and he was quiet for long enough that it became a specific kind of quiet, the kind that means the person inside it is doing real work. One of the men from the SUVs, younger, suited with the alert stillness of an assistant who had learned to anticipate, shifted slightly near the garage door. Laurent made a small gesture with 2 fingers, barely visible, and the man went still again. "Tell me the condition again," Laurent said. "The car goes on public display," Adrian said. "Not a private collection, not a climate-controlled room that 3 people a year see by appointment. A museum with public access. And the story of Frank Welder goes with it. Full documentation, properly attributed, properly told. The engineering, the history, the man, all of it." Laurent looked at him. "That's not negotiable," Adrian said. "The number can be discussed. That part isn't." The garage held the sound of the space heater and nothing else for a moment. "You know what most people would do," Laurent said, "with a $5 million offer on a car they bought for $100. "I know what most people would do," Adrian said. "I'm not most people." "Why does the engineer matter to you?" Laurent said. "You never met him. He's been gone for 40 years. Adrian looked at the car, at the damage and the rust and the work he'd done over the last 10 days, all the hours spent learning the vehicle the way you learn something you intend to keep faith with. Because he built something that changed how people think about a problem," Adrian said, "and the world lost him and lost the work at the same time, and someone should fix that." Laurent was quiet again. He walked slowly around the front of the car and looked at the damaged bodywork without touching it this time. "I know a Frank Welder story," he said, after a moment. Adrian waited. "Not a complete one," Laurent said. "I've been looking for this car long enough to collect pieces." He stopped at the passenger side. Welder was not from a racing family. He was a structural engineer by training, buildings, bridges. He came to motorsport sideways through a friend who raced amateur events in the late 60s. He had no business being as good at it as he was. He ran a finger along the top of the fender, just barely touching it. The ideas he put into this car, the frame geometry, the suspension work, they weren't just clever. They were decades ahead. He had figured out things about load distribution under racing conditions that the major teams didn't understand until the 80s. Laurent looked up. "Some of his ideas appear in vehicles that won championships, Mr. Calloway. Nobody credited him. Nobody could, because nobody knew he'd had them first. The documentation was believed destroyed. Until now," Adrian said. "Until you photographed 14 pages of a build log and a chassis plate that nobody else had found in 40 years. Laurent looked at him with something that wasn't quite admiration but was in the neighborhood of it. "Where did you find the plate?" "Under the dashboard bracket." Laurent exhaled. I looked at photographs of 7 vehicles over 40 years that people claimed might be the prototype. None of them were. I never thought to look under the dashboard bracket. He shook his head once. Because it's a ridiculous place to put a certification plate. It's the last place anyone would look, Adrian said, which was probably the point. Welder didn't trust people, Laurent said. There are things in the documentation, when I finally tracked down what records still existed, that suggest he knew the team was in financial trouble, that the car might be sold or lost or misrepresented. He left himself a way to authenticate it that only someone who knew the whole build would find. Adrian stood with this for a moment. The image of Frank Welder, a structural engineer who came to racing sideways, who built something 40 years ahead of its time, who hid his authentication mark in the last place anyone would look because he didn't trust the world to take care of his work, sat in the garage alongside the car itself. I'll meet your condition, Laurent said. Adrian looked at him. The Caldwell Rice prototype goes to the Southwest Automotive History Museum in Santa Fe, Laurent said. Full public access. I've been in discussions with them for 2 years about a Caldwell Rice exhibit. They have archived material, some original photographs. The car would be the centerpiece. He paused. Welder's story goes with it. I'll fund the research to complete the documentation. Whatever can be found, we find. And his name is on the exhibit, Adrian said. Not in small print. His name is on the exhibit. His name is on the exhibit, Laurent said. Adrian nodded. The number, Laurent said. 5 million. Accepted, Adrian said, and he said it without hesitation, which Laurent seemed to register. You didn't try to negotiate it up, Laurent said. The money wasn't the hard part, Adrian said. Laurent looked at him steadily. No, he said. I can see that. They shook hands. Laurent's grip was firm in the way of a man who had been shaking hands on significant agreements for 50 years. Adrian's was the same. How long do you need to prepare the paperwork? Adrian asked. My team can have documents by Thursday, Laurent said. Standard provenance transfer, authentication clauses, the public display covenant. You should have your legal team review the covenant specifically. I'll make sure it has teeth, but you should verify that for yourself. I will, Adrian said. Laurent took one more look at the car, a long one, the kind that carries a lot of time inside it. I would like to ask you something personal, Laurent said. Adrian waited. How did you see it? Laurent asked. In the salvage yard, under all of that. He gestured at the car's damage. What made you stop? Adrian thought about the moment, crouching in the dirt at Bertram's salvage yard, his hand running along the frame rail, Mason somewhere behind him cataloging everything by color and assigning it a points value. The geometry was wrong, he said. Not wrong, different. The pickup points were in positions I hadn't seen before. It didn't match any production vehicle I knew. He paused. And somebody had built this thing very carefully. Under all the damage, you could still feel the care in it. I don't know how else to describe it. Laurent nodded slowly. Frank Welder, he said, put 18 months into that car. By hand, mostly alone from what I've been able to piece together. The team gave him the space and the materials and largely left him to it, which was either their smartest or their most negligent decision depending on how you look at it. Probably both, Adrian said, but probably both, Laurent agreed. He left with his team at 12:30. The black SUVs pulled away from Sycamore Drive in the coordinated way they'd arrived, and the street went back to its ordinary appearance, and the 11 neighbors who had been finding reasons to be visible on a Tuesday morning dispersed with the frustrated expressions of people who had witnessed something significant without being able to determine what it was. Adrian stood in the driveway and watched the SUVs go and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was a kind of grief, not regret. He didn't regret the decision. The condition was right. He'd known it before Laurent arrived. But there was something in the fact of the handshake, the formality of it, the finality, that made the car suddenly, concretely, no longer his. Not yet, technically. But the direction was set. The trajectory was fixed. He went inside and made himself a sandwich he didn't taste and sat at the kitchen table for a while with the television off, which was his rule on weekend mornings and which he'd extended on some days to Tuesday afternoons when he needed to think. Mason was at school. The house was quiet in the midday way that houses are quiet, not peaceful exactly, but empty of the specific sounds that make a place feel occupied. Adrian sat with the quiet and the sandwich and the fact of what he'd just done. $5 million was not